Hello, it's Matthew from Zero Chippenham here. There was an update this week which took most people by surprise on the boiler upgrade scheme grant. And that is, it was being expanded to include air-to-air heat pumps and also heat batteries. Now, as I said, this took most people by surprise, not least because we're all watching the budget wondering how the bus grant is going to be changed. So the Department for Net Zero on the 18th of November announced that they were expanding the grant to include £2,500 for an air-to-air heat pump, or I think a similar amount, £2,500 for a heat battery as part of the boiler upgrade scheme. And I think this is great news actually. So we have this is a small garden room, you can see here, and this is entirely heated or cooled by an air-to-air heat pump. There's an outdoor unit. I'm sure you're familiar with them from mostly holidays abroad, let's say, where you've got air conditioning units outside, and it heats a space like this perfectly well. This is actually a really well insulated room, but you can heat reasonable size rooms with them. And I'm guessing the reason this change has been made, so obviously it's been part of a wider consultation, but I think if you have a small apartment, maybe, that's currently heated by direct electric heating, such as, let's say, old-fashioned storage heaters or an old gas boiler, then you can still be eligible for the grant. But fitting an air-to-water heat pump, which is quite a big installation and requires an internal water tank as well, may not be suited for very small spaces. So whereas with a small apartment, perhaps having a couple of air conditioning units like this, that can be so-called multi-drop. So you can have one outdoor unit that supplies a couple of different units. They can even heat hot water now in some circumstances. Some models can. So having this as an option is great if you've got a smaller space. Now, of course, if you've got an apartment and let's say you're in Chippenham, whilst most of these installations would come under permitted development, if you're in the conservation area, or even if it's something that affects visual amenity, you may well need planning permission. And there are two things really. Something that comes to mind was a block of flats near the Travelodge in Chippenham who had an overheating problem a couple of years ago and wanted to fit air-to-air heat pumps, which are essentially air conditioning units, and they were turned down based on visual amenity. So they would probably be okay if they had a service area on the outdoor unit was able to be hidden away on. So it's something to consider, that you do need to still site your outside unit obviously somewhere sensible. And with a small flat or apartment, particularly multi-story, you may need to check with the council planning authority, which is Wiltshire Council in the case of Chippenham, although your town council may also be able to help with some guidance, unofficial guidance. The other thing you need to take account of is noise of the outdoor units in proximity to habitable windows. So one of the interesting changes here for me is that so I've had lots of air conditioning units on an industrial premises. They're quite common in offices, as you know, and most air conditioning installers that I know of aren't MCS certified. That's microgeneration certification system. But in order to meet the bus grant, you need to be MCS certified. So you need to find an air conditioning installer or air-to-air installer who is on the MCS installer list, or you won't be eligible for the grant. So that's one thing. And there tends to be a bit of a swap over at the moment where air source heat pump installers under the current grant, where you can get £7,500 to swap out your boiler for an air to water system, so it runs through your radiators and heats your hot water. They typically come from a plumbing background, and aren't so-called F-gas certified, whereas air-to-air installers usually come from an air conditioning background and are F-gas certified, but aren't plumbers and haven't gone through the MCS certification. So you'd still need to have an MCS certified installer who does a heat loss calculation on your building, So it may, at least in the initial period, it might limit your options on installers. The other option that's been introduced is a heat battery, and the best known example that I know of these are a company called Tepeo, Tepeo, and you can look up some of their videos on the Everything Electric channel, who've covered them quite widely. And the idea with these is that they heat up on a low electricity tariff. They're sort of a super insulated unit that heats up to very high temperatures on a low electricity tariff, and then uses that to heat hot water throughout the day. So during the peak periods when your electricity would go up. So they're still quite big in some circumstances, and they're very, very heavy. So they're kind of the size of a washing machine maybe, but not as big perhaps as a water tank. So again, they're an alternative option. So it's great that the government and Department for Net Zero have broadened the offering available for people to get help decarbonising. And I was checking through the boiler upgrade scheme earlier, because a lot of apartments would probably have direct electric heating. It's not 100% clear to me what would qualify for the grant. Certainly storage heaters, I think if you had ancient storage heaters, they probably would, that needed replacing. I'm not entirely sure about direct electric heaters, so it's one of these things that you'll need to check as you're going through the grant process. And the other thing, of course, is we're waiting for the budget this week to see whether there are any changes to the grant in terms of eligibility. There are rumours that it might become means tested in some ways, but as I say, it's completely thrown most people that the Department from Net Zero made this announcement, and it's very positive news. And I think the government should make more of this positive news, really, because it's gives really a lot of options for people along their route to decarbonise. And of course, the thing about air-to-air heat pumps is the same as air-to-water. They are incredibly efficient. They have efficiencies of sort of 3 to 5 times. It's a different kind of heating when you're heating a room like this. It tends to sort of dry out the room more, I would say. The way you feel heat is often from radiant and a combination of air temperatures. So it does feel slightly different when it's heating a room, and it doesn't heat the fabric in quite the same way. But the advantage is, of course, they can also, almost all of them can cool. Well, I say all of them can cool. Whereas air-to-water systems, which the grant is covered up to now, whilst they can cool, I don't know of any company in the UK that's really installing them as a bog standard installation with the cooling option. So, we had an Octopus install, it's heating only. Everybody I know, Good Energy, I think, pretty much are doing heating only installations, because that's what you're replacing your gas boiler with, and that's what we need most of the time in the UK. But if you're in an apartment and it was built before the overheating regulations come in, and you're at the top of a building and getting overheating issues, this might be very welcome, so long as you can overcome any planning restrictions to situate your outside unit. That's it. Thanks.